Pontius Pilate does not get much space in the Gospels. He does make it into all 4 Gospels, which is more than we can say for Annas. But in John's Gospel, Pilate gets half of John 18 and half of John 19. This brief moment in the spotlight, however, does not mean that we will pass over him quickly. His small role is inversely proportional to his significance in the unfolding of events leading to the crucifixion. So we will spend 2 weeks discussing him. Last week, Jesus stood before Annas. Then Annas sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest. Today's passage begins, Jesus' trial before Caiaphas ended in the early hours of the morning. There are 2 things I want you to glean from that. Number 1 is that John didn't tell us anything about the trial before Caiaphas. The other 3 Gospels describe that, but John mentions it, but he either knew nothing of it or he considered it not worthy of giving details. The other thing I want you to glean from this is that Jesus has been up all night. On top of the knowledge of where this is all leading, the adrenaline, the cortisol, whatever is going on inside Jesus, he is now also sleep deprived. Keep this in mind as we continue toward the crucifixion. Jesus has been brought before Annas, a powerful man and a former high priest. Then he's been brought before Caiaphas, the high priest, and now he stands before Pilate, the Roman governor. He's being passed up the chain. Nobody wants to deal with Jesus. In Luke's gospel, Pilate passes him off to Herod. Problem solved, right? Unfortunately for Pilate, Herod sends him back. I want you to understand that this conflict between the Jewish leaders and Jesus was a no-win situation for any of these officials. Annas, Caiaphas, Herod, and Pilate, they could all see that. But the buck stopped at Pilate, and he cannot get out of dealing with Jesus. As you're aware, Israel is not autonomous at this time in history. Rome is governing the nation of Israel. While Israel can govern themselves in some areas, they do not have the authority to impose the death penalty. This begs a question that I'm sure you would think of. There are times in the New Testament when the Jews took matters into their own hands and they took a life, or they planned to take it. This one, from Luke chapter 4. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this, when they heard what Jesus was saying. They got up, drove him, Jesus, out of the town and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. Or how about this time when they planned to take a life in John chapter 8? The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say?" And of course, there is the first Christian martyr, Stephen, who preached a powerful sermon. And after the sermon, they covered their ears, and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. And of course, as you know, they did kill him. Remember, the accusation against Jesus is blasphemy. He is making himself out to be the Son of God. That's what has them all in an uproar. From the book of Leviticus, anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord must be stoned to death by the whole community of Israel. Blasphemy was serious business. If the Jews had been allowed to carry out the death penalty, they would have stoned Jesus. But remember what Jesus said just a few chapters ago, "And when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw everyone to myself." And then John adds, he said this to indicate how he was going to die. Jesus had enough insight from the Father to know his end would not be a Jewish death, that is, stoning. His death would be a Roman death, crucifixion, lifted up from the earth. The Jewish leaders were seeking to use Pilate for their purposes. They could not kill Jesus themselves, so they were determined that the Romans would kill him. In so doing, they were fulfilling the kind of death Jesus had foretold for himself. The Jewish leaders hated Jesus so much that they have lost all sense of proportion. Hatred will do that, won't it? I wish we could take this passage and the next passage together so you could get a sense of the complete loss of reasoning, the path of hysteria that these men have embarked upon. They become impervious to reason, to mercy, even to a plea for basic humanity. When given a choice between Jesus and any other man, they would take the other man, even if he is a murderer named Barabbas, who they would never defend under normal circumstances. These are not normal circumstances, however, and they are giving Barabbas preferential treatment because of their hatred for Jesus. Hatred overcomes all our senses. I want to point out a great irony in this scene. As you know, there are many things that could make a Jewish person ceremonially unclean. For example, when the Passover is being prepared, Jews remove all leaven, all yeast, from their homes. Leaven was understood to symbolize something negative. Let me give you an example from Matthew 16. Be careful, Jesus said to them, to his disciples. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they took his meaning to be something about the bread that the Pharisees and Sadducees eat. So he had to explain what he meant. And then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Any reference you'll find in Scripture to leaven or yeast is associated with something evil. When Passover was coming, Jewish people removed all yeast from their homes. At one time, I knew a family who were Christian Jews, and the mom asked me to hold her yeast for her until Passover was finished. She was getting it completely out of her home. Now back to my point about the great irony in this scene. As the Jewish leaders are standing at the palace of the Roman governor, to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Going inside would make them unclean for two reasons. Number one, the dwelling place of Gentiles was unclean, full stop. There's no going in the home of a Gentile. Remember how the Jewish leaders hated when Jesus ate with Gentiles, let alone if he actually went into their homes to do so? And the second way going into Pilate's palace would make them unclean is that any dwelling place that had yeast in it during Passover was unclean. There was the possibility of yeast inside Pilate's palace. So the Jewish leaders are being meticulous, as they so often were, to keep themselves ceremonially clean. And here is the irony. They're doing it while they are disregarding any teaching regarding love, mercy, or kindness. Jesus took them to task over this very thing in Luke chapter 11. What sorrow awaits you, Pharisees? Or as you're more used to hearing it, woe to you, Pharisees! For you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens, but you ignore justice and the love of God. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect. And what does Jesus call more important than tithing? Justice and the love of God and mercy and kindness. Our congregation renovated this sanctuary a few years ago, and I'm proud to say we did not fall out over paint colors. We did not fall out over the selection of the light fixtures. We did not fall out over choosing what carpet to put down. There are congregations that would split over some of those issues. There are churches that will fuss over trifles while disregarding God's law of love and forgiveness, the more important things. Churches where details of ritual and ceremony are attended to with the greatest care, yet there is no spirit of love or fellowship. So it's ironic that these religious leaders stand strong on their principle of we can't go inside, we have to stay out here, while they are spewing hatred and murder. I want to turn from the Jewish leaders now and look at Pilate. I've always been a little mystified by him, to be honest. Why does he acquiesce to the crowd? Is it a lack of courage? Is it a lack of conviction to stick to his own conclusions? But why would a man in such an exalted position acquiesce to this crowd? If this were a movie, we would be tempted to ask, what must they have on him that he is giving in to them? Context means a lot. And the problem for me was that John doesn't give us any context for this encounter. If Jeannie, at 10 years old, asked if she could have a girlfriend come spend the night this Friday, and Jeannie had been giving me a hard time for the last 3 days, I might be inclined to say no. But if Jeannie, at 10 years old, has been helping me around the house for several days and taking care of the things she's supposed to be taken care of, and then she asks if a girlfriend can come spend the night this Friday, I would very likely say yes. Context can make a big difference. William Barclay, in his commentary on the Gospel of John, explains the complicated way in which various Roman provinces were governed. According to how much trouble they caused, they could be governed directly by the emperor, or they could be governed by the Senate, or they could be governed by a proconsul, which I take to be very close or the same as a governor. Pilate was appointed in the year 26, and he governs until the year 35. He must have had the reputation of being a good administrator to be appointed to this position. However, this was not a plum position, and Pilate could not have been delighted to be assigned here. Consider, if you long to be the U.S. ambassador to France, and you get assigned to Namibia. So Pilate ends up in a country full of people that he holds in contempt. In the interest of time, I'm not going to explain the 3 incidents that William Barclay outlines. But William Barclay goes into detail about 3 times when Pilate and the Jews clashed, and Pilate had to capitulate. In one case, he was ordered to directly by the emperor, Tiberius. I'm asking you to trust me that there have been encounters between Pilate and the Jews where the Jews won the point and Pilate had to give in. So Pilate does not hold all the cards when it comes to this conflict. That is the part I had not known before when I wondered, why does Pilate give in to the crowd? So on this day, as Pilate faces a mob who is demanding the death of a man for reasons unknown to Pilate, Pilate is not in a strong position to defy them. He could once again be disciplined by the emperor. He could be made to not only give the mob their way, but at this point, he could lose his position. And as the encounter continues in the next chapter, which we'll get to in the next sermon, Pilate has to weigh whether to execute an innocent man or keep his job. First, he tries to give the responsibility back to the Jewish leaders. Take him yourselves and you judge him by your own law. After all, they aren't accusing Jesus of breaking Roman law. This is an issue of Jewish law. I'm going to let them settle it as their law says to do. And that would solve the problem. Pilate won't have to deal with Jesus. He won't make these shouting people even more angry. If people can't get along, I'm just going to tell them to go work it out among themselves. Have you ever known that to work? He talks to Jesus for a bit and he finds nothing worthy of punishment. So he reaches for his next option, the custom of releasing a prisoner at Passover. But any hope of that solution is soon dashed. We'll see the next time that he tries for a compromise. One side, the mob, wants Jesus killed, and the other side, Pilate, wants him released. So Pilate hopes for middle ground. I'll have him brutally scourged, and that will satisfy the mob. Of course, we know the result of that. So Pilate tries 3 ways to get out of his quandary. Earlier I said Pilate held Jews in contempt. As he and Jesus are talking, he asks, "Are you the king of the Jews? Is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about me? Am I a Jew?" In other words, he's been governor for a handful of years, but he's made no attempt to understand the people of this country, no interest in their thoughts, their minds, their culture, their history, trying to understand anything about this Messiah they've been waiting for thousands of years. And as Pilate faces a man who declares, "My kingdom is not of this world," I believe Pilate longs for something that Jesus has. And Pilate's question, "What is truth?" can be read several ways. Personally, I like the way it was delivered in that video. I've always heard it in my mind with a combination of sincerity and wistfulness, but also with resignation, as if Pilate had at one time sought truth, but now was resigned to never finding it. And in this moment, he wonders if he is looking into the eyes of a captive who might know what truth is. Instead of fulfilling his yearning, Pilate ends the conversation by going back outside. It would have been great if Pilate had grasped this moment. If he had let himself linger instead of going back out to the mob, if he had followed through on that small impulse that he might be in the presence of someone who was more than a captive. If he had asked Jesus some sincere questions with the intention of learning from him, but that was not to be. And that's not who Pilate was by this time in his life. As we watch the scene unfold, Jesus seems to be the one in control, and Pilate is bewildered and floundering. The question keeps coming up as we study together. What will we do with Jesus? Last week it was Annas, the soldiers, and the servants. This week it's Pilate, who tried every which way to get someone else to deal with Jesus. No one can deal with Jesus for us. Each of us must decide, who is Jesus, and what does that mean for my life? And we will continue with Pilate after Christmas. Amen.